It's time for more Manifesting Original Rich Bitch Experiences. I'm your host, Ava Beilke. Welcome back to the More Pod. I'm back with another guest today, and I'm so excited for this conversation. If you've been around for a little while or for a long while, you know that the point of this podcast is really to be exploring the things that really bring us closer to our true selves, the things that feel most authentic and most aligned. And so, whether that's travel or some crazy therapy experiment, self development course, there's so many ways that I think I love personally to continue to explore what really makes me me, and obviously share these things with you in case it resonates. And recently, I tried something new and I had to share it with you. So, I tried Brainspotting, which is a form of therapy. And the session was facilitated by a good friend of mine. And so she has been gracious enough to join the More Pod today to have a conversation with me about brain spotting and about therapy in general. And so, with that, I'm super excited to be welcoming Bridget Martinson to the podcast. A bit of background on Bridget: she is a licensed counselor and soul coach, and she specializes in depth psychology, brain spotting, and ketamine-assisted therapy retreats. In other words, she is not a regular therapist. She is a cool therapist. And she's really dedicated to guiding her clients in discovering their authentic selves and realizing their highest potential through intuitively led questions, subconscious exploration. She's also a Gemini sun. We love the air signs around here, a Virgo rising, and a Capricorn moon. Human design projector, and one of my favorite people, Bridget Martinson. Welcome to the More Pod.
Thanks, Ava. We made it. Here we are.
We made it. This has been a long time in the making.
Yeah, we've been talking about this for probably at least 2 years, I would say.
Yes. Since the beginning of the podcast. I'm like, one day, will
Yeah,
you please join me? And today is the day.
today's the day. Here we go.
And this is so fun because, like, obviously we are friends. And so I feel like through prepping for this episode, through having the brain spotting session, I've been able to kind of see a whole new side of you. Like, I get to see
Hmm.
professional Bridget, and it's so fun. And I'm so glad that we're doing this.
I've kept my professional side hidden from you until now.
I know, hidden and so secretive, but I mean,
Yeah.
that's part of the intrigue, to be honest. So I have a lot of questions for you. I feel like brain spotting is kind of one of these almost new age therapies, if you will. Like, I'm just starting to hear a little bit about it, a little bit of chatter. I wouldn't say it's like fully mainstream, right? So I'm excited that we're kind of going to reveal or kind of pull back the curtain on it today and how it could potentially help listeners if it's something that they're interested in. And so let's just dive right in. I want to start off with a very simple overview of brain spotting therapy, what it is, and really who could potentially benefit from this.
I think I agree with you. I would say any client that I have who I talk about, like if I do a consultation call and I'm telling them about the different types of therapy and modalities that I use, I would say most people don't know what brain spotting is. Oftentimes I'll say it's really similar to EMDR, and then people kind of know what that is.
Hmm.
Um, but I would say, really simply put, that brain spotting is a brain based therapy. It was discovered by a clinical psychologist by the name of David Grand. And he actually was doing EMDR therapy. So he worked a lot with really complex trauma and worked with like trauma-based type therapies, and he was doing EMDR, and he sort of coupled that with a few other modalities that he was doing. He actually realized while he was doing an EMDR session with a client that clients tend to spontaneously gaze at a particular point when they're discussing an intense emotion or maybe even traumatic memories. So then he just kind of was just kind of playing around, kind of with trial and error, and had the client fix their gaze at that point, and realize that it really led to deeper processing and trauma resolution through kind of fixing their gaze at that point and utilizing what we call focused mindfulness processing or brain spotting.
Mm, that is so interesting. I've always observed, like, when I'm thinking about something, I definitely will kinda look, like, off to my left or off to my right, not necessarily for, like,
Mhm.
traumatic, like, not always in, like, a mode where I'm thinking about something super serious, but I do feel like
Mhm.
I'm the type of person when I'm talking or thinking about what I'm gonna say next sometimes, and I'm probably even doing it right now, like, I'm looking at a certain point, and it sounds like that's kind of what his jumping off point was to kind of peel back this layer, is that right?
Absolutely. Yep. So he was
Mm,
really using the visual field to connect with a certain memory or emotion. But essentially, it's just based on this idea. And we talked about this when we were doing our brain spotting session, that where you look affects how you feel. So
mm,
I think we were, even in our session, we were using an activation point, like something that was causing you a lot of stress. And then we are also looking at a point that was more related to expansion and possibility. And I remember you
mhm.
saying, like, wow, I feel much differently about this situation when I look over here versus when I'm here and really deep into this processing.
Yeah. Yeah, I was really surprised by that. Um, when it comes to, like, all of the therapies or, like, all the kind of reasons why somebody might be seeking support, like, how does brain spotting come into the picture? Who could it be good for, and what types of challenges does it really solve?
That's such a big question because I think it can be really used for a lot of different things. I think traditionally, like when we think about brain spotting and even how it was founded, it's traditionally used in like a trauma focused type of therapy. So it's kind of like, oh, EMDR or brain spotting. It's this really trauma specific type of therapy that we do. But if you break down what trauma means really basically on like a really basic level, um, trauma is actually anything that disconnects us from our authentic self. And that could be due to an event or some programming or events that we've been through. Um, so, kind of anything that's preventing us from expressing our true nature and potential. So, if you
Mm,
think of trauma in that lens, brain spotting and trauma focused therapies can be really used for anyone and in a variety of different situations. I was kind of thinking through this, like, can brain spotting be used with anyone? And there are some situations where it might not be the best option, or like an
mhm,
instance where you wouldn't really use it. And that's like if someone is actively having a manic episode or actively experiencing psychosis, like those instances, you wouldn't use it. But um, there's just such a wide array of things that we can use brain spotting for. It can be, addiction, depression, anxiety, chronic pain, even athletic performance, or creativity and expansion. So it really is wide ranging.
mm. Wow, I love that kind of breakdown of the definition of trauma because I think that in my mind, I associate the term with, like, a really extreme, kind of dramatic experience, and
Mhm.
I think everyone has had, those heightened, very extreme experiences. A lot of times, for me personally, it seems like I kind of, like, downplay them. I'm like, "Oh, it wasn't that bad," or, "It wasn't," or, like, "I haven't had that much trauma, like, I'm fine, like, I don't maybe need this or that." But when you share that definition, it's like, that's really expansive just to understand that, like, we've all experienced, being human, a lot of trauma, but it's not necessarily, like, in the ER, for example, like it's not that extreme. And we can kind of access it at different levels, it sounds like.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. We often think of it as one really significant event, like going to war and being on the battlefield and having this really intense experience. And we often think about it in terms of like PTSD, and that's certainly a piece of it. Um,
Mhm.
but like you said, it can be kind of like death by a thousand cuts, like just different things that have kind of happened to us over our lifetimes, just living within this world and society that have kind of buried our authentic selves and kept us from being more us, just like you talk about on the podcast.
Mm, yeah. I feel like therapy in general, and as a therapist, I'm curious about your take. I feel like therapy in
Mhm.
general over the last few years has become such a trendy thing to claim.
Mm.
Like people are saying, "Oh, calling my therapist," or like texting my therapist. Like it's become just part of normal conversation. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
And it's like I think that a lot of times when it's used more broadly like this, I think people are talking about talk therapy, right? Like a traditional kind of talk therapy situation where you get on the phone or you get on Zoom and you kind of just like chat through things. And I know that talk therapy is so incredibly helpful for a lot of
Hmm.
people. And I also know through my own experience and through, chatting with other friends that there's so many different types of therapies. And,
Hmm.
sometimes it's helpful to kind of go a layer deeper than talk therapy. I would love to understand from your perspective, one, do you love that everyone has a therapist these days? Or like, what's your take on that? But two, what's the difference between, traditional talk therapy and something like brain spotting?
I actually really do love that everyone has a therapist. I think it takes away a lot of like the taboo-ness of like being in therapy, because I feel like when we were even just growing up, like unless there was a major concern going on, I didn't feel like, at least where I grew up, I grew up in
Mhm,
like really small town North Dakota. So not a lot of people had access to therapists and not a lot of people were in therapy unless their
mhm,
functioning was like severely impacted. And now, like you're saying, like it's super normal to be like, I just talked to my therapist this morning and we're all kind of at brunch talking about our therapist, which is an interesting thing because I think, people are talking about me at brunch.
in a good way, I'm sure.
But hopefully. Um, so I do love that a lot of people have a talk therapist because it really normalizes this idea that we go through complex things and we live in a world that's not easy to navigate, and we're all just doing our best and trying to uncover our authentic self. And I think that therapy is just a really beautiful space to do that, to heal through trauma and to really find like the newest version of you that we're all really after. And,
Mm,
therapy is just one way to do that. And within therapy being one way to do that, there are lots of different types of therapies, right? So there's talk therapy, which I do and I love to do. And I think there's definitely a time and a place for it. And then there are things like brain spotting, which is more brain based and uses, like I think we've talked about this when we were doing our session, is one of the main differences between talk therapy and brain spotting is the part of the brain that it uses. So when you go and you talk to your talk therapist, you're using, like, I'm putting my hand on my forehead right now just so you can see, you're
mhm,
using the prefrontal cortex. And that's really like CEO Ava. It's like the
mm,
logical, analytical part of you,
yeah.
right? Which you probably use a lot just from knowing
Oh,
you.
too much.
So, for someone like you, getting into a different part of your brain can actually probably be even more helpful for you, right? So, with brain spotting, we're doing subcortical work, which means we're back here in this limbic part of the brain. Um, And that's essentially where our trauma is stored, in that limbic part of the brain. And I also like to refer to it as the seat of the soul. So not only is it where the trauma is stored, but it's also where our soul lives and where some of these creative answers can lie too.
Oh, that I love that. Ooh, I love that. It's so interesting to learn about the different parts of the brain, and you nailed it, like for me personally, and I know a lot of people, like we're always in this kind of like front mindset, like active brain,
Yeah.
and it's like there's so much more. There's so much more
Mm-hmm.
that we never tap into, and I think that it's so interesting to hear that brain spotting targets completely different area of the brain. I mean, that's the endorsement it needs, like right there. It's just a new part of the brain to unlock. And especially if that's
Absolutely.
really where we store trauma.
Yep. So that limbic part of the brain gives us access to these neural networks that are involved in trauma processing and emotional regulation. So brain spotting really is based on this idea that the brain has an innate ability to heal itself through finding homeostasis. So one really, really cool part of that is it helps people find that inner healer within themselves and trust their own experience and find this inner guidance system. Because I think sometimes, like what you were saying, when people are like, oh my gosh, I need to call my therapist or I need to text them. Like, I can be a space holder and I can be a guide, but ultimately, I really believe and hold this idea that you have the answers inside of you and we're just trying to find them. And I think brain spotting can be a really beautiful way of really showing that to people, that this is
Mm,
all you doing your own healing. It's like
mhm.
empowering.
Oh, totally. That's absolutely empowering, and I think that's a great point to make because I do think sometimes, like, when I've been in states of, like, crisis mode where I'm like, SOS, like, what's the astrology? Like, call the therapist, do all the things. Like, I'm kind of outsourcing and I'm not making problems other people's, but I'm looking for, external solutions to my own problems. And I think, well,
Hmm.
sometimes it's just fun, like, for the story, for the plot of it all. But you're right, where it's really about, like, empowering because I do believe that we have all the tools we need, but sometimes we really do need other people to kind of like hold that space. And that is something that should not be, undervalued because I mean, it's such a special thing when you can connect with other humans and really have them be there for you as you're working through your shit.
Yeah, and not to undermine this idea that we want to be healing together, and it's great to have a guide and a space holder with you, but also just holding this idea, like you said, that our we're no longer looking for external authority like we've been programmed to do for so many years. We're in the age of Aquarius, we're moving into the age of Aquarius, we're finding internal authority and we're helping each
Mm.
other do it. And I think brain spotting can be just a really beautiful, magical way for us to do that. And obviously, I'll be the first one to say too that I love to randomly say, like, what's the astrology? What's going on? But
Yes.
we, we
We're calling
really,
ourselves out.
yeah. Yeah. Ava and I aren't really like, I'm calling my therapist girlies. We're more like, we're calling KJ, we're getting to the bottom of this. We need our
Yes.
astrology.
Yes, absolutely. Like, what is it? What is it today?
And even
Um,
that is a really great tool for us.
totally. And that's the thing, like, collecting all the tools, like, building the toolbox,
Exactly.
it can never be too full. More is really more.
Exactly. More is more. And being open minded to all the different types of tools that are out there.
Yeah. I wanna talk about the experience of having a brain spotting session.
Yeah.
And you took me through this, and I think that I went in like with no kind of research. I kind of just went in and was like, all right, I trust you. Like, what is this about? I'll learn in the moment. And I think you did such a great job of kind of just walking me through that. So I love to go through, what is a brain spotting session? Kind of what are the steps? What happens? What can somebody expect if they were to start a brain spotting therapy treatment?
So I'll just kind of go through a little bit about like what it would be like to be in a session.
Mhm.
But just keep in mind, like the only way to fully experience this is to have a really hands-on experience like you did, Ava.
Right.
But essentially, just breaking it down really simply, we would I would just ask you. I would say like, what feels like for your highest and greatest good, what is the issue or the topic that you want to be working on today? And we would really decide mutually what the issue is or what's feeling really activating for you. Or on the other hand, it could be, what are you really wanting to grow in right now? What does it look like to step into the next version of your creativity? So it can either be from this activation processing point, or it can be from this like really expansive, I want to be working on my highest potential type point. And sometimes it's both, just like we did. We found an activation point for you, and we also found an expansion point, and we just went back and forth. But
Mhm.
essentially, we always start with like an issue or a topic, and then we talk about that together. Another really important thing that we do is we make a mind body connection. So I'll say to you something like, when you're talking about that really stressful situation, where are you feeling that in your body? And you might say, oh my gosh, when I talk about this or when I think about this, I just get such a lump in my throat, or my chest starts to get really, really tight. And then together we would find a brain spot that correlates with this issue using your um, vision field. So together we would find a brain spot, and we can do that many different ways. And I've been trained in a lot of different techniques to use with that, kind of depending on what the issue is. Um,
Mm.
and then, and I can just use my pointer if you want to see. So let's just say
Yeah.
like your brain spot was right here, and then you would
Mhm.
go into what's called focused mindfulness processing and keep your gaze on this point. So it's kind of like this deep meditation in a way, but what makes it really different is finding the point that correlates to the issue, and then also having a counselor or a coach or someone with you to really hold that space for you. That
Mhm.
really changes the feel of it as well. So the therapist will be holding like a safe container, and then we'll process from that point. And then later on, we talk about that and do some integration around it as well.
Mhm. I'm trying to think through, like, my questions as I went through the experience, like, what is the
hmm
integration like? Like, what is to be expected after a session?
So, integration, like the basic definition of integration, is meaning making. So, it's essentially
Mm.
just getting curious about what came up and then asking yourself, like, what does this mean for me? And how can I tangibly implement this into my life? So, oftentimes, what integration looks like with brain spotting is, I might at the end of the session just kind of check in and say, like, what was that like for you? What came up? Because the truth is, you and I aren't doing a lot of back and forth during brain spotting. It's much more client led, and it's a lot more meditative in the sense. And talk therapy is more back and forth, but we don't really experience that as much in brain spotting. So we
Mhm.
might take the last few minutes to just get curious about what came up. But truthfully, I like to keep people in that subcortical part of the brain, that limbic part of the brain, for as long as possible. So, we could have gone our separate ways after your session, and a lot more could have come up for you. As I don't know, but I
Mhm.
like to keep people in that for as long as possible. So I often say, just hydrate, rest, maybe journal if things come up for you, but just get curious if anything more comes up within the next 24 to 48 hours. And then the next session, we might check in and say, like, last time we were focusing on anxiety around your family. Let's check in and see how you're feeling about that. Or what else came up in between our sessions. And that's really what integration is.
Mm. Mhm. And what is the kind of, like, cadence or frequency? I assume everyone kind of has their own cadence, but, is brain
hmm
spotting a one-time thing? Is it a weekly occurrence? Like, what's a kind of
hmm
traditional maintenance plan, if you will?
I think that is just varies so much person to person. Like, we might be working on something really specific, and you might get all the resolution that you need in one session. You might have something
Mm,
like significantly change after, and you're like, yep, that's what I needed. That unconscious piece of information that showed itself was what I needed to make this next step and move forward. If we're working on something more significant, or not necessarily even more significant, but just something that's more deeply rooted, it might take several sessions to kind of continue to resolve and process that and move that trauma through the body. Like, let's just say like you really were involved in like a war or a combat situation, and
mhm.
it takes several sessions for us to kind of work through that and see all the ways that those tentacles really wrap themselves around you and your authentic expression. um, so I would say it really varies. What I often find in a therapeutic type setting is a cadence of once every other week feels really great to people, because it allows a lot of time for them to integrate and kind of see what came up for them and really work with what came up. Because I think sometimes if we're doing maybe weekly or twice a week type sessions, it doesn't always give
Mhm.
all of that time and space to fully kind of digest what came up.
Mm. That makes sense, and I think for
Mhm.
anyone like me who likes to, like, try and cram in as much as possible, I can see how that could really squish the integration and the processing, and I think that just comes with kind of, like, deprogramming from, like, living a crazy Monday through Friday 9 to 5 life, but I feel
Yeah.
like my first inclination would be like, "Okay, well, like, how often do we need to put these on the calendar?" And, like, see you in 3 days, but yes, because you can't really, like, force the timing of what might unfold after the session.
Absolutely. And healing is often not linear, and we would love it to be really linear. And we'd love it
Mm.
to be like every other week for 3 months, and this will be resolved.
Yes. And then you're fixed, and then you're perfect.
Yeah.
Never had a trauma ever, like, healed.
Yep. Hmm.
That is true. Thanks for bringing back that quote because healing is not linear, and I feel like that's something we can never remind ourselves of enough, like, just when you think you might have kind of, like, closed one chapter, it might pop up.
I'm just curious too, like maybe you wanted to share with the pod like what it was like for you, because like you said, you came into it
Mhm.
really blind, not having done a lot of research. I didn't prep you for it except,
Yeah.
right before the session. So like, what did it feel like?
Yeah. And I'm super excited about the fact that 1, I got to have a session, thank you, it was awesome, and 2, I wanna talk about it because I think that, having gone through it, it kind of gives some tangible examples, and so I'm happy to and I've dabbled in a lot of different therapies. Bridget, you know that like recently I did some hypnotherapy for the first time. I have done EMDR. Um, I actually don't even know if I've ever had talk therapy though. Isn't that funny?
Mm.
Brain spotting. I've tried brain spotting. So I think for me, I really didn't know what it was. And I kind of intentionally didn't do too much research because I wanted to just go along for the ride. I think that when we went into the session and you kind of explained to me as you just kind of gave this overview of what it is, we identified those 2 points, right? So there was one point I was looking at that felt really uncomfortable, and then there was a different point that we were looking at that made me feel like so awesome and so expansive. And I was really surprised, honestly, at the contrast of how I was feeling just by looking at those different points. You know me well, and you know that I brush off feelings quite often. And so for me to kind of like tap into how I was feeling, and you're kind of like, well, where do you feel it? What is this like? Creating that mind body connection, as you said, I was just overwhelmed by like how different they felt. Because I think that like my ego or my active brain would be like, well, clearly just looking over there isn't going to do anything. You know what I mean? Like if I was to bring the most
Mm-hmm.
skepticism ever, I'd be like, what do you mean looking off to the left is going to make me feel awesome and expansive and like excited about life? But it did. And so I think that was one of the things that really surprised me.
Absolutely. And a cool thing about brain spotting too is like skepticism is very, very welcomed. Like
Mm,
no one is trying to be the expert. And it's like, one of the main things that David Grand, like the founder and the main sort of trainer when it comes to brain spotting says is like, let's just observe with curiosity and give time and space and see what happens. So there is really absolutely no agenda. And it's really cool too because we embrace and embody what's called the uncertainty principle. So
mm,
it takes a certain type of person to be able to facilitate and do brain spotting, because the truth of the matter is like both you and I, Ava, had no idea what was going to come up and what was going to transpire in the session. So we're
yeah.
both like, I'm like holding this pointer and we're like, let's see what happens, you know?
And I'm like
So
looking at that
skepticism,
pointer. Yeah.
yeah,
You're holding the pointer saying what's going to happen. I'm looking at the pointer saying what's going to happen. And here we are.
exactly. And we're in it together and we're just curious about what's going to come up. So I just say that to say that skepticism is very welcomed. And there's probably going to be listeners who hear this and are like, yeah, right, that sounds weird. I'll stick to talk therapy,
Hmm.
which is hey, whatever you choose.
Yeah. Yeah. So that was one of the first things that that was a key takeaway for me. I was like, wow. Another thing was, you know, to the point of like having to kind of like let go and just see what happens. You kind of gave me that expectation going in. And I think that helps me because I would kind of traditionally lean towards being like, okay, am I doing this right? Like, am I looking at the point properly? Was it exactly right there? Was it not, that front brain that you talked about taking over? And so I think just kind of the way you set it up, I was doing my best not to go into that mode. At one point, when I was looking at the spot that didn't make me feel good, I literally felt the back of my brain like refiling. I'm not joking. Like I felt it.
Mm-hmm.
It was happening. And it was just so interesting to try and hold that sensation of like that subconscious processing while kind of knowing like I was like not supposed to interrupt it, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
But I said to you, and I'm
Absolutely.
like, I feel like this was happening. Like I feel like there was filing going on.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it really goes back to what we talked about before, just believing that your brain has the ability to heal itself. And some things
Hmm.
may have gotten misfiled along the way. And we're giving it time and we're giving it space to find its own regulation and homeostasis within this topic that was really activating to you, or that maybe triggered past traumas that you've dealt with and were kind of unaware of, right?
Yeah.
Just like we were saying, it really gives us access to those neural networks that are involved in trauma processing and emotional regulation, that we don't really get to tap into on a regular basis.
Yeah. And to ground it even further, I'm willing to share like what the theme was, what the topic was, and really what
Mm,
came up. And
okay.
so, we started our session. I kind of picked the theme, and it was just what was most top of mind for me in that moment,
Hmm.
which was home. So, I've been doing a lot of experimenting with home, literally and kind of emotionally, in terms of like, what does home mean? Where is home? Earlier this year, I did some work on emotionally, like, home is in my body. And as long as I'm with myself, like I'm always home, no matter where I am physically. But in the 3D world, there's always the physical component of home as well. And so what came
Mm,
up in our session for brain spotting was like, I'm in the process of transitioning. I'm about to go out on my digital nomad journey again. And so I'm moving. And I was, looking for a space that felt good to me, that I felt like would support me and kind of make me feel safe. And heading into LA, honestly, like the housing market is tough. There's
Yeah.
not a lot of options. Like I was looking for a specific, midterm rental, furnished, specific neighborhood area. Like there were a lot of kind of layers to it. And it felt like I knew I didn't want to settle, but it also just felt like it was bringing up something for me. Like there was a trigger happening around home.
Hmm.
And then when we went into is it the activation point that was the one that didn't feel good?
Yeah, the activation point was the one.
Yeah, the activation point for me, and I'll try to summarize it because it was really deep, but essentially it was around home and leaving the home that I've been in for 10 years and a fear around potentially not having a home. And then that kind of spiraled into, well, what does it mean to like own a home? Does anyone truly ever own anything? Like we're all kind of on borrowed time, on borrowed land, borrowed rules, laws, regulations. And then it went, a layer deeper, which I have some Native American heritage. And it went as deep as like, reservation land. And like, if someone tells you this is your home, like, does that really mean anything or not? And it went further than I thought it could have ever gone. And I think, Bridget,
Hmm.
like what I just shared with you in the moment was like, it's ancestral, like it feels ancestral. And like that was like layers and layers deep. And I wasn't expecting that, obviously. But something refiled there, right? Along the way on that activation point. And then the vitality point, expansion point, the one that felt good, was really all about calling in like the best possible home. And like something like specific small that came up was like, I want it to be a place that I want my friends to see. Like I want to be proud. Like I want to kind of like show it off. Like I want it to be not just a place where I can squeeze my bed and my laptop, but I want it to be spacious enough that I can have people over. And like there were kind of layers of enjoyment to like not just having a shelter, but having a home. And
Hmm.
I got really excited when I was looking at that point and processing there. And 2 days later, I locked in a lease.
Oh my
So I'm like,
gosh.
this is the best case scenario.
That's amazing. And you just briefly mentioned that before we started the podcast today, but I'm like
Yeah.
really just hearing about it for the first time. So that's so cool that that came up.
Yeah. And of course, I didn't know it in the moment. And so back to the kind of integration period and the meaning making, like, I understood that a few days later. And like, obviously, like, life had to keep unfolding and showing me like the next part of the whole thing. But
Hmm.
now, a couple of weeks later, I'm like, and this is what happened. Slay, brain spotting, sign me up. When's our next session?
Hmm.
So it was a really powerful experience, and that's kind of like the meaning I've made of it. I'd be curious. I don't know if you're willing to share.
Hmm.
Do you have experiences, personally with brain spotting? Like, how did you kind of get into or gravitate towards this therapy? Like, did you have a session or how did you discover it? And how do you personally experience it?
It was really so random, to be honest. Like, I started with working with with one of the private practices that I'm in right now in 2021, and I was offered a training reimbursement to use for like a trauma specific type therapy, and I was deciding between EMDR and brain spotting.
Mhm.
And I just did just a tiny bit of research on both and realized that brain spotting is a lot more flexible. It's a lot more client led, where EMDR, there's a lot of like protocol and it's like more structured, more protocol driven. where brain spotting is a little bit more relational and attunement based. So while we were in the session, I'm like looking in your eyes, I'm holding space for you, I'm checking in to see like what's going on emotionally, physiologically for you, and just kind of holding this container with you. So I really
Mhm.
liked that it was more relational. So I just signed up for the first, phase one brain spotting training and just really fell in love with it. There was something really, and I don't even know how to describe it, but something really spiritual and magical about it. And I loved the idea that it really embraces this idea that our brains can heal themselves, and we have we have our own, like we talked about, internal authority that we can tap into. And obviously I'm obsessed with like soul coaching and anything that has to do with like soul psychology, and I feel like this
Mhm.
just perfectly fit with this idea that we have this really calm, grounded inner guidance system within it, and we all have it, and it's often just covered up, or we often just don't know that we have it. And so brain spotting is just a beautiful tool to help us get back to that.
Mhm.
So did the first training and have been doing it ever since, and have done multiple trainings since then as well, and have also been involved in being a training assistant as well.
That's so cool. Do you have, like, in your trainings, do you go through sessions? Like, do you do sessions on each other?
Yeah, yep. So every time you do a brain spotting session, at first you might be the therapist, and then the other time you're the client. So each time in
Mm.
a training, you're practicing 3 times, and you're also getting brain spotted 3 times. So I've had my
Mm.
own sessions several times.
Awesome. I'm trying to think, is there anything else about brain spotting that you wanted to touch on?
One thing that I guess we could say too is it's really good at being integrated with other different types of therapy. Like
Mm.
some therapists use what's called internal family systems, which is parts work. Brain spotting can be beautifully blended with something like that. Another thing that we talked about earlier on is the idea that I do ketamine assisted therapy or ketamine assisted retreats. And I
Mhm.
actually have used a lot of brain spotting when it comes to working with ketamine clients as well. So another
Mm.
just great thing about it is it's really transferable and can be integrated in with a lot of different types of therapies.
And I'm glad you brought that up because I want to ask you about the ketamine therapy. This is another one I think similar to brain spotting, at least in my mind, is it's newer, right? Like it's starting to be offered, it's starting to become accessible to some people. But I think that there's a lot of, I don't know, confusion around it. The first instance that I heard about it was, like, probably a BuzzFeed article that was like, "Elon Musk, too much ketamine, like, he's lost his mind, like, he's using it recreationally." And then you're like, "Yeah, I'm doing ketamine, retreats." And I'm like, "What?" I was so confused because that was the only association
Mm.
that I had to it, was reading that, some people are using it for partying, and I'm like, "Hmm." So, obviously, like, that's not the point here, but
Mm.
what is ketamine therapy, and can you tell me a little bit about the retreats? I wanna do one of these, this is on my bucket list. I haven't tried it yet, but what's the deal with the ketamine therapy?
Mm. Yeah. And I think we can just name that, like, the word ketamine kind of feels a little scary, I think. Like, I feel like
Yeah.
you've probably mentioned this before, like, ketamine just feels like a weird word, and, like, what is it, and should we be using it, you know? So just
Yeah.
naming that, it feels a little weird. Um, but in its basic sense, ketamine is a molecule, and it has many, many different uses. So it's most commonly used in like a surgical setting as an anesthetic. So
Mhm.
at certain dosings, it can be used for you when you're like going under to have a surgery performed, right? And it's been used for over 60 years. Its safety profile is very, very good. It's essentially what's called a dissociative anesthetic. but in the right dosings, you can use it for in a psychedelic dose. So essentially,
Mm,
you're going to have like an altered state of consciousness in the right dose. So with all of that being said, you can really, really see how this isn't a drug that you want to be using recreationally. Like
yeah,
it's
yeah.
super, it's very, very important to have a provider that's been trained in getting the proper dosing for you, because dosing can really, really, really impact the experience, right?
Mhm,
So what makes ketamine assisted therapy different than, ketamine use for surgery or ketamine use recreationally, which I obviously don't advise at all, is
no,
the dose. So you really want, like I said, someone who knows proper dosing for you to have this altered state of consciousness, to have a psychedelic experience. And then what's also called the set and the setting. So the dose, the set, and the setting are what make ketamine assisted therapy different and beneficial for
mm.
clients.
That is all important information to know. Thank
Yeah.
you for clarifying that. Setting, dosage, psychedelic type of experience. That makes sense. Now I do feel a little less apprehensive about it because it seems
Mhm.
extreme when you Google it and you're like, "Oh my gosh, like I don't know how this fits in." Um,
Mhm.
what is that retreat experience like, or how do you kind of administer this psychedelic experience for other people?
Mhm. Yeah. So I'll just talk a little bit first about like what ketamine is used for, or how it's experienced. So, you know how we were talking about depth psychology and this idea of tapping into the subconscious mind, and how brain spotting is one way that we can do that, right?
Mhm,
Ketamine therapy is another way that we can tap into this unconscious mind, but the vehicles in which we get there are different. So with brain spotting, we use brain spots to tap into the unconscious mind, right?
mhm,
And with ketamine, we're altering brain chemicals a bit to temporarily lower our defenses to have deeper processing. So
mm,
you go in and you have like oftentimes a psychedelic experience or an altered state of consciousness, um, and then some of this unconscious information has the ability to to show itself because some of our defenses have gone down, right? And
mhm,
ketamine also is a very natural anti-anxiety type of medication. So the experiences that I've had with it in my trainings, ketamine is actually, in my experience, and I can't speak to everyone, is it's very, very gentle, and it's very like anti-anxiety. So you're in this psychedelic experience, but you're also in this really non-defensive, relaxed state while you're in this psychedelic state. So it's actually like my experiences were very relaxed and very beautiful. Not to say that hard things didn't come up, they definitely did, but it almost made
mhm,
it easier for when hard stuff did come up. So, like I said, so that we use the brain spots, and then we also use brain chemicals to kind of lower those defenses and do some of that deeper processing that we get to experience in brain spotting as well.
wow, that's so interesting. Anti-anxiety.
Mhm.
That makes sense because I feel like, sometimes if you want to kind of go out and have a bit more of like a not unhinged, but a little more like creative experience, you don't also wanna then have anxiety come up. So it sounds
Exactly.
like this is kind of a nice route of controlling some of those factors that might otherwise hamper the experience that you are hoping to have.
Exactly. Yeah, and
Okay.
so I'll just talk a little bit about like our retreats. So
Yeah.
I work as a ketamine assisted therapy retreat co-facilitator, and also an integration coach at a practice here called Peak Interactive Wellness, which was
Mhm.
founded by one of my really good friends, Bailey Cronin.
Mm.
So Bailey and another practitioner there by the name of Renee. They're both mental health nurse practitioners. So the mental health nurse practitioners and I, we hold these ketamine assisted therapy retreats. And kind of the layout of it is we really wanted to create a space where people could heal together. So healing in community. And another thing about ketamine assisted therapy is the price can be a bit high. So
Mm,
doing it in more of like a retreat or a group setting also makes it more accessible for people regarding price.
mhm,
Um, so we've set up retreats where we do preparation work with people. So you're getting like a full diagnostic assessment in the sense where they're reviewing your mental health history, your physical health history, and just making sure that you're a good candidate for it to begin with. And then
mhm,
they'll do some preparation work as far as like, what are you anxious about? Is there anything regarding ketamine or this experience that we can answer to kind of make this a more calm, easeful experience for you? Because one of the big things with ketamine is being able to drop in and let go. But if you don't trust ketamine and you're really worried about, like, is this the right dose, all of these things, that's going to keep you from dropping in. So
mm.
preparation is really, really important because it helps like get your questions answered. It helps ease anxiety. It helps you to talk about anything that may be causing stress or anxiety going in. So we have preparation, and then also on the day of the retreat we have really beautiful like ritual type ways that we prep for the medicine journey itself. So we offer meditation, yoga, um, acupuncture that Bailey does in the ear to kind of help calmness and
Mm,
help people feel more calm and less anxious.
mhm,
And then we'll have a group journey together, and then that typically lasts around an hour and a half to 2 hours. And then after you come out of your altered state of consciousness or your psychedelic experience, we join together as a group and talk about, like, obviously it's all, you get to choose whether you talk about it or not, but we talk about what came up. And a really beautiful thing about doing community healing in a group setting is something could have come up for me that I share that also is really, really important for you to hear too, and vice versa. So it's like not
mm.
only am I getting what I get from the experience, but I'm also getting all of this wisdom and knowledge from you sharing your experience. So it's really a beautiful, like, communal way of healing as well.
That makes a lot of sense. I feel like in situations where I have been part of something that has like a group share or something afterwards, it is very common for somebody to share and you're like, "Wow, like that really resonates with me," or like I was having a similar experience. I feel like when you're
Hmm.
in kind of containers like that, you're not sinking, but it feels like there's just some interconnectivity that I do agree is like also
Absolutely.
like very it's a nice experience to have if you haven't done like a group kind of healing before.
Absolutely. It just shows like we're more alike and more connected than we often like to think too. Like a lot of people are
Totally.
experiencing the same or similar things that we're experiencing. And it helps to
Totally.
share that load with each other.
That's true. I feel like everyone thinks they're so unique and different, and we are, and we are, but we're also all the same. Like, we are having the
Absolutely.
same, like, simulation human experience, and you nailed it with that part. You talked a little bit about, accessing a retreat like this. It could be a little more cost effective. I'm curious just to know if somebody listening is interested in taking the next step and looking into brain spotting therapy, looking into
Mm.
ketamine therapy, like how do you recommend that people get connected with therapists, providers? Like, where's a good place to start?
Brain spotting can be done by therapists, like traditional type therapists, and it can also be utilized by coaches. So there's coaches and therapists who have been trained in brain spotting. It's often best if someone's done brain spotting 1 and brain spotting 2. That's really like a good overview for people. There's a brain spotting website. I don't know what the name is offhand, but we can definitely put it in the show notes.
Mhm.
Um, So there's providers that are listed on that website who have been trained and certified in brain spotting. Another way to access brain spotting is through my coaching practice, Coaching by Bridget. That can be another good way for people to get connected as well.
Yes. And I'm so excited for Coaching by Bridget. I know you've been working on building out your own practice and your own website and all the things. And so I'm super excited to link to that in the show notes and make that connection because I value you as a friend, obviously. But I also really value the space that you hold for this healing work. It's really special, and I would love for everybody to be able to experience it. And I think that I'm maybe a little biased, but I think you're the perfect person to hold that space and facilitate
Hmm.
that experience. So I will absolutely link to your resources in the show notes. Is there anything else, Bridget, that you want to share with the More Pod fam today before we wrap up our chat?
Just kind of the main share, I guess, or I guess two of them is like you said, Ava, you said I have it on my bucket list to attend a ketamine assisted therapy retreat.
Yeah,
So
normal
we
bucket
offer
list
those.
item.
Yeah. So we offer those through Peak Interactive Wellness. It's a practice here based in Denver, Colorado, and it's open to anyone. So even if you're not a resident of Colorado, you can fly in and make a trip and attend one of our retreats. And I foresee us probably having one later fall or winter. That's probably the next time we'll have that. But
Hmm.
another thing too is, like Ava said, I've been working for a while to get a website launched for Coaching by Bridget, and that will be happening within the next couple weeks. And Coaching by Bridget is kind of me creating what I wanted a lot of like many years ago. In
Mm,
2020, 2021, I went through just a really big dark night of the soul, which I think a lot of people did. It was one of those times where a lot of things, crumbled, and I had an opportunity to really relay my foundation and really build my life from more of like a soul centered place instead of like, I don't know, like maybe programming or mind centered type of way of being. Um,
mhm,
and in that time, I was seeing both a therapist and a coach, and I found them both equally really helpful. And they provided guidance in unique and both really important ways. But I
mhm.
realized I wanted someone who could do both, and that's kind of what I created with Coaching by Bridget.
That's amazing. I love that you created what you wanted. I think that's some of the most powerful any business, any practitioner, any service provided. It's like when it comes from that place of wishing you personally had that resource, it's just bound to
Hmm.
be like the best thing ever. And so I'm so excited for you. And I cannot wait to see how it just takes off because I know it will. Thank you so much for sharing with me. I'm super grateful that we could have this brain spotting session. And then I'm so glad that you agreed to come on and share it on the podcast. I cannot wait to continue this journey. Maybe we'll do a part two with a ketamine
Hmm.
retreat at the end of the year,
Yes,
check
love
off the
it.
bucket list, come back to the pod,
Hmm. Let's do
and
it.
we'll go from there. Thank you so much, Bridget.
Thank you, Ava. I appreciate it.
Listen to the More Pod every Wednesday as I share the things that make me more me and discover a thing or two to make you more you.